Welcome to The Roll Forward, a podcast for the next wave of finance leaders, especially those looking to transform their roles by making smarter, faster, and more profitable business decisions using the power of technology and a forward-looking approach to finance. Listen in to learn how to get out of the back office trenches and become a more strategic partner within your organization.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Roll Forward podcast. My name is Joe Michalowski, and this episode is brought to you by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. And today, my guest is Peter Nesbitt, a finance and operations executive, a startup advisor, fractional CFO, and more. I am learning recently. Peter, thanks so much for joining me.
You're welcome, Joe.
Cool. Well, today I'm really excited to talk to you because as I, pondered through your LinkedIn, saw a very interesting career path for you, and I wanted to do a podcast episode for a while about career paths for finance executive or finance pros.
Yeah.
So that's really what we're going to dive into today. So as a starting point, we kind of do this for every guest, but it seems more appropriate than ever. But do you want to give your background on how you've kind of gone through the finance space?
Yeah, for sure. So, I'll start just saying as you probably mentioned, I had another entire career doing military intelligence before I even started undergrad. So I enlisted in the Army out of high school. But, when I was an undergrad, a lot of my friends are going into investment banking. I didn't really know what that was at the time, but it sounded like a fun and interesting place to go. I knew then what table I wanted to be at. Like I wanted to be at the table where the big deals are being done. And I wasn't quite sure who I wanted to be at that table. If I was going to be the CEO, the CFO, the banker, the investor, maybe the consultant or the lawyer, but I knew what table I wanted to be at. So I started my career in investment banking for 2 years doing M&A. So pretty brutal lifestyle, as bad as it sounds, 100 hours a week, pretty regularly. But I learned a lot. And, frankly, a lot of those connections as well and people I've met along the way have been helpful. And then after that, I thought I'd try the investor hat on and went to Carlyle, which was a publicly traded asset manager, to doing private equity buyouts, and actually felt I was farther and farther away from actually the operations of a company. And so, when many of my friends were moving into the buy side, as they say, which is either hedge funds or private equity, and I realized actually I want to be an operator or give it a shot. So I made a sort of a hard decision of walking away from a very well-known, tried and true path to a specific lifestyle and income and prestige and all that to move into startup land. And now looking back, I've probably advised a couple dozen other former bankers, finance folks, as they want have this interest in tech and hey, I know sounds cool, or maybe it's a better fit for me. When I started, and I frankly didn't have good mentors in this space and didn't really know what I was doing, but I was just lucky, frankly, and applied to a well-known consumer internet brand in New York City called Bitly. They make the long link short. I'm sure you've seen. I initially applied just for a 1 month consulting role to build their first 3-statement operating model, present it to the board. And this was in 2015. And interestingly enough, they made it through a Series C and never actually had a functioning operating model. This is the wild, wild west of New York City tech startups back in the day. And that was my first real intro into the tech finance world, and really realizing that you don't have to be at the bottom of the totem pole for years to actually make an impact. That my first week there, the CEO of Bitly, Mark Josephson, is hey, Peter, what do you think of our pricing? And I'm like, well, I think it sort of sucks. It's okay, how about you go fix it? And you're like, what? I just started here. I don't know anything about the company. You're telling me the new junior guy to go fix what feels like to me a very important part of your business. And just even the access, I can set up a one-on-one with a CTO anytime I want. And, just the camaraderie and just sort of traditional sort of startup vibes of in banking and, traditional finance. I remember getting a glass of water, having a conversation in the water cooler. It was anxiety driving because I feel like I need to be back at my desk. There's just this feeling of FaceTime, feeling like you need to be working and grinding. This sort of perception of how hard you work is a really big important part of that world. Whereas I remember my third week at Bitly, the VP of Eng talks to me for 20 minutes over lunch. I'm like, what are you doing? Shouldn't we be back at our desks? And so it was a hard transition, frankly, and not knowing really how to navigate my way into tech, but it worked. After my first month, I decided to stay full time, and sort of the rest is history. I've been in tech, for the last 7 or 8 years.
Wow, we're gonna dig into so much of this, but a lot of that, I can't believe. Honestly, the thing that stands out to me, I can't believe Bitly made it so far with no operate. Like I'm talking to Series A first finance hires now. They were like, yeah, that's like priority number one. Come in and build that
Hmm.
operating model. I don't know what was going on in 2015, but if that was the norm, like we are so far from that now. Like that's just
Hmm.
not how you can get by. But yeah, I mean the background, it's exactly why I wanted to talk to you about this topic, because it's just so wide ranging. It's not like I was
Hmm.
a big four accountant and then, I moved into startup space and then I was the VP of finance. Like that, that's a
Hmm.
pretty linear path, but really love that. I think broadly a question I'll ask is just, it sounds like maybe you didn't know how the path would go, but I'm surprised you had a pretty good idea, even with the intelligence analyst background, that you knew where you wanted to be. And that's not something that I'm familiar. Like I've never really had like a solid understanding of like, yeah, this is where I'm going. So I'm curious, like, is there anything that surprised you about how your career path has unfolded?
Yeah, I didn't really know what it would take to like move into more like executive roles when I first started at Bitly. And frankly, I didn't really know the other sort of roles. And like looking back, frankly, like there's one part of me wishes I just had gone in, into an SDR role rather than a finance role. Like I think, usually the top AE at a company should make more than the CEO if they're doing their job right. And so if you're optimizing for, income, like even if you're coming
Mm,
from finance, it might be sound like beneath you to be in a sales role, but really if you're, really want to be paid the most, like you should be in sales. And frankly, if
right.
you want to start your own company too, like if you want to be a CEO, that's one of the probably better spots to be from is being, in the sales role. And so I think things like that, like I just didn't really know what's customer success, like
Mm,
what's your career path and customer success look like. If you either as like stay career CS or you move into product or you move into, customer experience. There's all these other sort of like avenues across tech that, especially if you're a junior in your roles, like how can each of those move over time? And then again, to your point, like unless you've seen a bunch of other peers and other folks in the industry make those moves, it's really hard to visualize that career path starting out without much exposure or much experience in the tech space. And I
yeah.
think it's also hard to your point, like big four and investment banking, like that career path is one direction. It's up or out. And, in tech, it's sideways, upside down, backwards. Like you can do whatever you want in tech and in terms of, you know, taking on new responsibilities, either because you have to or because you want to.
It's so true, and and it's true for every profession. Like even in marketing, like my job, that's what I'm experiencing now. Like I was at agencies for a long time, and
Hmm.
now, working here, my first taste of like startup life, and it's like, oh, this can really be like whatever you make it. And so where I want to start digging into your story about where you've gone is what you said about that tough transition from big company to startup land. And so just to learn a little bit more, because you're at Deutsche Bank, you're like, yeah, making all these big deals, and to your point, said you were getting further and further away from the operations. And I'm curious, like, can you talk a little bit more about the challenges there and maybe any like words of wisdom for people thinking about going from that super corporate environment to the one that you kind of live in now?
Yeah, I'd say it kind of comes around like a few things. Like one is idea is trying to build your network, and I
Yeah.
think understanding the opportunities coming from, I think there's a lot of people go into finance for the prestige and the money, right? Like that's why you become an investment banker. You want to
Yep.
say you're an investment banker and you know and live that lifestyle. I think sometimes people have a hard time, like, oh, I want to, like, I remember when I came to Bitly, I remember telling the then VP of finance, like, I'm strategic finance or high finance. I don't want to do an expense report or payroll or whatever. But frankly, once I actually did those things, it was probably the most like influential in terms of my understanding of accounting and how real cash flow works. Like
Interesting.
in banking, you're doing like very, very simple Excel equations to forecast cash flow, or, we call net working capital. And looking back, I had no idea what that really meant. Like
Yep.
until you're actually seeing cash come in and come out of your bank account, that is a completely abstract concept. And so I think that was I think it's building your network around, people who are in tech to understand the different routes. That doesn't just have to be corporate development or doesn't have to just be in the finance or chief of staff role. It could be sales, it could be CS, it could be product. But even then, that don't let your ego get in your way.
Mm,
Like our careers are long. We're going to work to our 70. That's like 50 years of work. like you can take a year being junior again, but with, again, thinking your 5 or 10 year vision of like, if your goal is to be CEO or, start a company or, or be an executive at Fang, like whatever it is, right? Like tech's big. I've been working primarily early stage, like C to Series C, but like you can go later stage as well. Like having that sort of longer term vision and knowing that like 1 year on the sideline or, on the sidelines as an SDR or as a junior PM is okay if the longer term vision is, what you want. So I think those are some ideas that I think for anyone who's like in the finance or even in a, big four accounting and more a corporate role, like where you start isn't where you're going to end, where that is definitely true in the corporate world. Starting, if you don't get a start at an investment bank, you're not ever going to become an MD. Whereas in tech, you can start wherever and frankly end up wherever as well.
I think it's such a good point. I like what you said about needing to kind of you're in investment banking, you're seeing all this happen at a high level, and then you get into the startup world, and you have to actually like do the operational part, like you have to do the expense reports. This may be in like a silly question, but like, what did you do to learn like the nuts and bolts of that stuff? Like I assume they didn't give you runway in startup world to just teach you. There's no training for it, so you needed to figure that out on your own. And I'm curious like how that went for you. Was that stressful? Did you feel like you had like a solid handle on it? Like what was that time like?
Yeah, I read something like 500 articles and white papers on tech across every
Yeah.
part of the business. Every time I heard a term or a role I didn't understand, the good news is a bunch of companies like Mosaic write a bunch of white papers on their subject matter expertise, right? In your case, FP&A and modeling and planning. And if you don't know much about what that means practically, the good news is you can go download a bunch of these white papers. And I did that for every sort of role, whether it be like quality assurance or SDR or sales ops. And some of these terms, I'm like coming from banking, they don't have any inherent meaning to me, not being in tech yet. And, they're just reading tons of blogs. And so I spent probably my first 2 years reading 2 hours plus a day on various tech topics to just get up to speed. In my case, on SaaS, on tech, on early stage investing and fundraising, on just all the different roles. And I think, I've talked about this a lot across a bunch of other podcasts and formats and Forbes and other places I've spoken and written, is that like finance is that the realization I had coming, in is like, I'm not this ivory tower of like, I'm strategy. I'm actually in the weeds. I'm like maybe more like the nervous system, right? Like I touch every part of the business because I touch all the money. Whether you want to hire a new SDR, whether you want to run a new marketing campaign, whether you want to, choose, this new product you want to develop, all those sort of things ultimately impact finance, impact, there's some sort of return on investment you want from that. And so I think having finance really, as a finance person, understanding all aspects of the business is so important. And so I think that's, a key element there around like coming from that world. To your point, I remember like coming from Bitly, I kept on saying our revenue is 15 billion, not 15 million. Like I'm so used to using very, very big numbers, things like that. Like it's, just realizing the scale and getting down into the weeds enables, I think, anyone to be just a better business person at whatever scale of business they ultimately want to work at.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot. I'm pretty sure the first time I ever worked with you, I was in the background of a webinar that you did with Joe, our co-founder,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a lot about this. It was like, yeah, this job isn't really, it is about like your Excel skills and your ability to build a model, but so much of it, like being that executive level in finance, is being able to collaborate across the business and really understanding that you are at the intersection of everything going on. And I can imagine that feels more true in, to your point, a $15 million company than it does when you're like a cog in a really, really big machine. I have friends that my wife works at Liberty Mutual, and I have friends in the finance department there, and like they have whole teams dedicated to like a board deck. And I'm like, the people that I'm talking to every day, they're doing everything. Like
Mm-hmm.
like I'm sure you could, if you moved in, like, and to your point, just read and absorb as much as you can. But it's among my favorite things that I get to talk about with people like you is, getting that understanding of not just finance. Because to me in marketing, I'm like, oh, it's finance, like putting together
Mm-hmm.
spreadsheets over there and tracking the numbers and what's the budget. And it's just so much more than that, which is why I find this audience like as interesting as it is.
Yeah. And that's usually like, I think because there's sort of the two transitions, like, right, what's your first path into finance or the finance department, like whether it's from Big Four or from banking or somewhere else. And I think it's also like, what's that next step to get you to like a director or VP level? And I think that's the key piece that can get you prepared, not only to understand where you want to go, like, do I want to stay in finance? Do I want to go take a PM role instead? Versus like, oh, I want to be VP of finance. In order to do that, I know I need to at least be, I don't have to know marketing to be a VP of marketing, but I need to be like, be dangerous enough to go mano a mano with a VP of marketing who wants to triple his or her budget this year.
We do that on our side. We want more in marketing. That's what we ask for. And you're right. There needs to be an understanding there, because you can get really buzzwordy on the marketing side and just start throwing terms out. And if you're just the money person, you have a tough time, or just be the gatekeeper, and you don't want to be that either. So to that point, I do want to move into talking like rising the ranks of finance. So at this point, like you've talked about, kind of, all right, we're out of the iBanking world, we're into startup tech, which is our audience. So that's where we're going to focus. And I know you moved up really quickly at Bitly. You mentioned like you came in, it was just that like 1 month that you were building that one operating model, and then turned into a full-time gig. But what were some of the projects you worked on that helped you stand out in a way that helped you move up so quickly? Like, what were the difference makers there?
Yeah, good question. I think in my case and in many cases, I think there's a lot of luck involved, right? Like I was at Bitly, like my the only other finance person, VP of finance, left after my first year, and I just happened to be the only guy around.
Who's it gonna be?
It's like, but more importantly, to your point, like I was ready to take on that role. Like I had basically taken on and been involved in every major project on the finance team in that year. Had gone out of my way to actually help us rebuild a RevOps function, start a BI function. And so I'd taken on all these like sort of high visibility projects where I was working directly a lot with, or, updating the CEO on the different status of these projects. I mentioned pricing being another one. And so I think that those are all important things to hang your hat on in many ways, of like volunteering to, that's a good thing about a startup, right? Like there's always more work to be done. And so if you can identify cross-functional projects that could use your analytical skills and your effort, then they're great places to start. And like price is a good example. I'm going to interact with the head of sales, the head of marketing, the head of product, in those conversations. Building a sales or RevOps function, similar, right? I work with customer success, I work with sales, I work with marketing. And like you're going to work on these kind of cross-functional projects, generally with the leadership of all those teams, enable, even as a junior person, really gets you, again, that insight into those roles. But again, I think the experience to know that, okay, here's how all the pieces work. Because really, to be the head of finance, I think you do really need to understand how all the pieces work of what accounting looks like and what finance looks like. And frankly, I didn't, when I got promoted, like, by the way, like I'd never ran payroll before. I had to run payroll for the first time cold, like with just like a Google Doc, a pass down notes of how to run payroll. Like there was just so much stuff. And thankfully I had a good accounting team, underneath me. Like, so I think that really helped as well. Like I wasn't completely lost in the dark. I was able to kind of teach myself accounting, because again, coming from banking, like my knowledge of accounting was, pretty poor, frankly, compared to what you really need to understand. At least, again, like I'm never doing journal entries or, but I do need to understand like, why does deferred revenue go up or down in a given period, especially for a SaaS business, which is actually really hard to understand. Coming from banking, just as an example aside with that, is like, you're like, oh, deferred revenue must be related to revenue, so I'm going to forecast it as a percentage of revenue. That's not how accounting works in SaaS. And so I think those sort of insights were important. But like I was able to learn quickly on the job once I got promoted. And so I think those are kind of the two pieces, is really around giving yourself as much exposure to senior people early on. And then once you do have the opportunity to move up, take it, and then find people around you to help you level up. And like the things I did at that time when I got promoted to head of finance at Bitly was I joined the CFO Leadership Council, which was then probably one of the only CFO communities. Now there's a bunch, right? But like that was kind of the OG, or one of the better ones back in the day, and still is a great one if you're in probably 30 cities they're in. I also found a mentor who is a CFO who's been there and done that, and so I could call up and like, hey, I've never done this before. How do I do this? And then I also started my own, really started building out the FinOps Slack community that I had back in the day as well. And that was another, just community for people to come into and talk shop, and like, hey, I'm getting these tax notices. What do I do? Or I need to do, work with an auditor. I've never selected an auditor before. What do I do? And so like those are the sort of resources I think that surrounding yourself and not realizing you don't have to go it alone will help you not only get the job, but keep the job.
I have so many follow-up questions, but the one that is on top of my mind, I have some that are like a little high level, but the really tactical one that I think I want to ask about this is about what you just said. You said you found a mentor, which
Mhm.
I think is a very common piece of advice. It's like find a mentor, but that is not that easy to do. Like they don't just like drop down. And if in finance, you're not like marketing and salespeople are usually like out, like we're on social media and like we're very like loud, we're very public. And finance people are usually more reserved. You know, that's changing, I think. But the stereotype is that they're more
Mhm.
reserved, they're more in the background. And so do you have any tips for like finding that mentor? Like where did you find your mentor? How did you come across that opportunity? Obviously starting the community is amazing, but I think that would really help people listening is like if they think they want one and they don't know where to start, any tips there would be awesome.
Yeah, looking back, I could have probably been more proactive about it. It was just actually sort of happenstance. I
Yeah.
met a friend at a party who was a VP of sales or head of sales at another software company. I was telling him about just venting. I'm like, oh man, I'm like way over my head here. He's like, oh, that's funny. Like you should meet my boss who's a CFO, or like, this guy who works at my company. He's a CFO. I was like, okay. And like, it sort of just happened by accident that I was introduced to my mentor at the time. And, we didn't talk that many times, frankly. It was like
Mm.
maybe 3 or 4 times in my year's leadership and ability, but it was enough to give me confidence that I was in the right direction. Because I think
Right.
so much of it's some of the level is actual knowledge, but the other piece, just knowing I'm going in the right direction is a big piece. The third thing I actually had, I think it's also worth mentioning, is we had an interim CFO who worked, I don't know, an hour a day. Same thing, like not hands on, but again, could like answer question like, is this the right direction? It's like, yes, go that way. Okay, great. And like that's I think that's another key thing for a lot of companies. I think they're missing is that they may have a controller who has a lot of like potential, or even like a finance manager has a lot of potential, but you know, to get them to the next level, they don't need a full-time CFO. They really need someone to come in, you know, to that point, just be the sort of mentor and the guidance to help make sure there's guardrails and they're going in the right direction. I think that's a really useful paradigm for a lot of earlier stage businesses. Up until probably like Series C, you don't need a full-time CFO, COO sort of person, but you definitely need someone who can like point your like high potential, mid-level, managers in the right direction.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point about like actually just working with mentors too, because
Hmm.
it's not, hey, I don't know how to do this. Let me go get the answer from this person every time I don't know how to do something. Like you're still the high potential, high drive person who's going to go figure it out. You're going to read all those articles, you're going to
Hmm.
read all those ebooks. But to your point, like it's that confidence. It's like that one thing that's missing that they can give you and you can put it all together and kind of run with it. So I think that is something, at least in my space, that people miss a lot is that, the mentor is not there to be like like the professor from college. It is like the gut check on that thing that you're working on to send you on your way so you can keep driving yourself. So I
Hmm.
think that's an interesting point. The other follow-up question I had, and you mentioned a lot, you mentioned exposure to the CEO was great, but one thing that stood out to me was the cross-functional projects that you mentioned.
Hmm.
And there were a lot of great examples in there, but I'm wondering what you think the kind of core skill set is to be good at working with those cross-functional teams. Like what does it take to make those successful? Not necessarily the projects themselves, but building those relationships
Hmm.
and being the kind of person that can accomplish those tasks.
Yeah, I think the first piece is not making it transactional.
Mm.
And how can you help them in ways that are not related to it? An example of that at Bitly, our head of CS was a great and actually like truly like world class CS leader and is pretty famous for that. But like at the time, I didn't really know Google Sheets or Excel very well. Put a 5 in one cell, put a 8 in another cell, and pull out our calculator and calculate it, like things like that. And like, but how can I enable other people around me? And I think
Right.
that's a key piece of like being helpful all the time, because you come with a set of certain skill set, primarily around turning ideas into numbers and then interpreting that. And that's what the life of an analyst is using Excel or Google Sheets. I think that is a superpower that a lot of people don't have. And whether it's the HR team who frequently also needs to manage data but doesn't have the skill set around Excel, whether it's the sales team who's trying to do sales forecasting, the CS team that's trying to do capacity forecasting, all that sort of stuff. Like those are the opportunities to just be really helpful. And that builds relationships that are not transactional. And then when you do need them, there's, hey, I would love to work with you on this thing that I'm kind of seeing that we're not doing, we're not doing upgrades correctly. And I'd love to have you actually document that correctly in Salesforce. It's a lot easier conversation around that when you're trying to do, say, a Salesforce cleanup project and you're spearheading that and are asking the CS leader to, have his team do extra work. And so I think it's around being, it's around being like really the sort of like helpful person that can build lasting relationships.
Yeah, I mean, having that non-transactional mindset seems, I mean, it's what I hear anecdotally in a lot of these podcast episodes, and I'm glad we're kind of making it specific about growing your career, because it's not just, am I going to do well at my job today? It's like, this is how I level up my career to your point, going from associate level to, Bitly's VP of marketing, or I don't know what the specific title was, but getting that executive level. Yeah, those are really
And if you think about, like, as you get to become an executive, right? Who's your team when you're executive? It's not the finance team anymore. It's the executive team, right? You're working towards one goal. And so taking that mindset early on in your career, and obviously you should focus on your team and your team's goals too. And those should be making sure you're hitting those out of the park as well. But like with your extra capacity and time, consider the company or one team.
It's a really interesting point. I never really thought of it that way, but you're right. Like the executive team is not other finance professionals. But to the point about your team in finance, unless you are like a serial early stage, like you just make a living out of being the first finance hire, and then once the team starts growing, you leave. Presumably, being at that executive level means you are going to build your own team. You're going to start being a manager. You're going to get beyond IC work. So that was one thing I wanted to ask about, is just what are some of the keys to leveling up on the management side? Because it's not all about, working on that pricing project with the sales team and the revenue team. It's really about, leveling up your employees. And that might be difficult for people who are used to being in the weeds of investment banking or accounting or things like that.
Yeah, I would say that it's probably my investment bankers are notoriously poor managers, right? And they don't usually have to manage a lot of people. They're not people managers, they're poor people managers. And like I think it's not part of really the job description for most of them anyway.
Grinders.
Like you're sort of, and so I don't think a lot of people see good management in their career, let alone experience it. And so I think it's finding good examples of that. And the good news is, other teams tend to have really good management. So I think if you have not seen what good managers look like because you're relatively new to tech, try to observe that in other teams. Like I find a team that's high performing and figure out what the manager's doing that makes it so, and use that as an opportunity to emulate. That being said, I think there's a bunch of things that a manager needs to do. I think one is identifying good talent. And so I think it's, how do you interview? How do you create job descriptions? How do you, bring in and recruit good people? So I think getting good people is a really important piece of that puzzle. And so that's one part of it. I think the other piece is when you have good people or just people in general, how do you help them grow in their careers? I think it's a lot around communications and alignment. Like I think if people aren't performing most of the time, there's like the fundamental attribution error, which is the most common thing I think a lot of people have, is like, oh, this person is lazy, or this person isn't motivated, or whatever. That's actually not, you're doing a judgment of their character versus understanding of their motivations. And so I think management's about understanding motivation, and most people respond, if you can actually understand people, like get to understand that person and what motivates them, you can actually manage them. And sometimes that like maybe not being the right place in their career, or something's going on in their personal lives that's, taking them away from that. And that's okay. You may have to ultimately, terminate employees for this, that, or other reason, but ultimately that sort of understanding of the whole employee is really important. Like even so as I mentioned, I was in the Army a long time ago. Even the military, you do essentially a 360 every single month with your manager, where they talk, when I say 360, sorry, you're actually talking not just your personal life, but also your professional life. And so I remember as a manager in the military, helping people plan their wedding or have their, wife buy a house when they're, deployed, all these sort of like personal things, because helping them solve their personal goals ultimately flows into their work life. And if they're worried about something at, at home or, with their family, then they're not going to be focused on whatever you want them to be doing. And so I think for me, again, you obviously have to, if they're up to it, right? Like not every employee is interested in bringing their personal life into work, but like I've done my best to help, an employee who wants to start their own pottery business or whatever it might be, to give them goals and hold them accountable to their personal goals, as well as
Yeah.
the goals I have them for, on the team, the finance team.
I love that. I don't know what to say. I mean, I'm sure it's a very underappreciated part of the management job, but you're so right. Like it really is. Like if people are distracted in their personal lives, they are not going to do the level of the job you need them to do here. And it's not transactional like that. You just, as a manager, I think you just truly need to like care about the people who are under you. And yeah, no, it's really nice to hear that that's part of your experience. That's really cool. It's
Yeah.
a great way to put it.
And I think the other piece around that is like ultimately employees are going to leave. You're going to want to help them grow into whatever they maybe internally, but maybe externally. And like I've helped employees leave the companies I've been at as well in terms of jobs that I think that might be better suited for them in their career paths. And then later and vice versa, when they've left, I'll recruit them to my next company. Like I think that's a piece around building good relationships with people, to your point, with a quality of care, I think matters and can drive, high performing teams.
Yeah. I mentioned this earlier, but this comes up on every podcast episode. And I love that these episodes it just never comes down to, I wish I had built up my modeling skills earlier in my career. Like they're really important, but I just enjoy kind of getting to talk to finance leaders, to talk to people like you about that relationship building aspect, because I just don't think it's an appreciated part of the finance job. I think the stereotype is like they're in the back, they're just crunching numbers, and it's just not the case. Like if you just talk
Mm-hmm.
to somebody in this role, it's just not what you all do all day, and it's really
Yeah.
nice to get that out into the world.
Yeah. And I think the last piece is like, and this is something I work on all the time and I'm constantly finding myself opportunities for myself to improve around, but it's around communication. It's in communication every way. Like being a finance person, you're very, generally speaking, going to have maybe the best context in the business and probably a way to think about the business at a different like way than other people can in terms of both depth and breadth. And it's easy to, and then this is where you're talking to your junior employees who are like be an accounting manager or talking to the VP of Eng. It's easy to forget that where the people are, where they're coming from and what their understanding of the business or the situation is. And so I think part of that management aspect is also around communication. And that's how do you communicate effectively and clearly, and to have the humility to, when the communication fails, is not the problem of the listener, but it's the problem of the speaker, and taking ownership on that and correcting that for yourself of like, oh, this person didn't get it. And it's not because they're dumb or lazy or busy or don't care about me or whatever it is. It's actually because I didn't communicate this effectively.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And I mean, honestly, everybody could learn that. I think everybody slips up on that. I know I do, and it probably applies to every job, but it's a great point. And yeah, I love the sort of management chat that we've been going down, but I think we should transition into sort of life after that, like VP of finance, that lead finance person at
Mm-hmm.
the tech startup, because to your point, there's a million ways you can go. And you yourself, you went from the finance lead to the COO at Teampay,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
now you're off doing fractional CFO work. And so I don't want to ask, I think I had like a bunch of questions listed about this, but generally I want to hear your thoughts about making a transition from finance, or maybe VP of finance at a Bitly at a Teampay, into the next step. Like, how do you think about where to go from there?
Yeah, good question. So I think there's a couple of things. It's one is like, do I want to be finance for life? I think that's the first question. It's like the answer is like some people are like, yeah, I love finance. And the question is, do I want to be at this stage forever? And if you, and some people love this stage. I know people who are serial VP for finance and love being this sort of A to C, and the company will sell or run out of cash, whatever it might be, and they'll do it all over again. And that's where they love to be. Some people want to have an aspiration to be CFOs of public companies. And so in order to do that, you need to be probably in a VP of finance seat at like a late stage company, or, at a more junior role at a, recently public company. That's a very, very different life, right? Like I think that the work that a CFO at a public company does is, in my limited experience, quite a bit different than the life and the work that you do as a VP of finance of a small, 100-person startup. So
Yep.
I think if you have those aspirations, you should definitely go down that route. And that means probably like taking even if you're the head of finance at a Series B company, you're going to be probably 2 or 3 rungs down the ladder at a much later stage company, and be able to know that that's part of, again, your path in order to, if you that's where you really want to be. But I think there's a lot of routes, right? Like I think you can, in my case, I was like, I want to do more general management. I was looking at either a COO role or more of like a general manager role, like where you own both go to market and product as well for like a product line. And so those are the sort of roles I was looking at when I was making that decision, because I want to have more general management experiences. Like ultimately what I want to do is I want to be CEO someday of my own company. Like that's my what I want to do. And so it made sense for me to have more general management experience versus more finance experience. That being said, like, one of the best pieces of career advice I got from actually one of my mentors was like, Peter, you're always gonna be the most analytical person in the room. Like, right. Like that's just your background. If you can sell, you'll always have access to capital. And so like a lot of my time I've spent in the last probably 4 years at Teampay was selling the company in terms of pitching, right? Like I was doing a lot of fundraising and also being on sales calls and just understanding the kind of just generally how to, how to talk to people and how to, the broad idea of like, of sales. And so I think those are things like for me, like that was an important part of my journey on that, because like having access to capital, is a really important part if you want to be either a CFO or a CEO of any company. But I think there's just so many other paths. I think that's the important thing is let's talk to a lot of people. Now there's a lot of networks out there. I said CFO Leadership Council is one of them. There's CFO Alliance, there's Pavilion now, there's Operators Guild, Controller Collective, like all these communities. Go find people who do the roles that you think you might be interested in, one or two clicks, 1 or 2 roles ahead of you, and figure it out and say like, hey, is this something that's interesting to me? And so I think that's a real important piece. I mean, other roles I looked at as like, do I want to be the operating partner at a VC fund? And so I could be like a VP of finance across like 10 portfolio companies. Like that sounded sort of interesting at one point to me. That you could also take an investor, you can move to an investor role from these things. And so there's a lot of different sort of pivots that people can make in their career. More recently, I've decided to do the fractional piece, partially because, for me, I think it's been a fun opportunity for me to have flexibility in terms of who I work with, how I work with them. Yeah. And just to see if it's something I like, if like, do I want to be in-house and full-time in one thing, or is it nice to like not be as committed to like one specific idea or company? And there's pros and cons to both of those, experiences. And so it's just something I've been, trying out for the last 2.5 months.
Really cool. I think my takeaway from all that is that, what you've said about finance kind of sitting in between all of these functions, kind of having the deepest or the broadest perspective of a business, it's kind of the best springboard for whatever career that you want to take. If you really commit to those cross-functional projects you talked about, like you can kind of go wherever you want. And I think that is unique to finance. Obviously, like anybody can make whatever pivot they ever want to make.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's enough resources out in the world that you can basically do whatever you want to do. But it seems to me that finance uniquely sets you up to kind of move into whatever part of a business you would like to be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it does. And I think the reason a lot of finance people don't take those pivots is because there's a lot of fear, right? There's this fear of like, what if it doesn't work? Or,
Yep.
and I'll speak for myself. I had a lot of fear along the way around, oh, should I go earlier stage? Like even when I was going to Teampay, like that, a lot of my mentors said, Peter, you should go to a late stage fund because if you want to be a CFO of they thought I want to be a CFO of a company. It's like, you should do that. Like going to Teampay as a Series A makes no sense. That's going backwards, right? Like that was their opinion. But for me, like I didn't want to be in finance long term. I wanted to have exposure to a bunch of aspects of the business, and I got that, and really enjoyed that. And so I think that battling that fear and realizing like, again, like our careers are long, our skill set's always going to be wanted. So you take a year off to go, even if you're a VP of finance, to take a year off to go be PM somewhere or try to start a franchise or like buy a business off of, like a small business association loan. Like there's a lot of like little pivots that people want to do with their careers, like go to get a real estate free, like whatever, like come back. Your skill set isn't going to go anywhere.
True.
You'll still be valuable and hireable in a year or 2 years if whatever sort of side hustle or hobby you want, or idea you want to chase down. And I think that's a piece that I find. I talked to a lot of their VPs of finance, and like I asked them like, oh, why are you still here? Why are you still in this? Like, because a lot of times like they're like, I don't know if I want to do this forever. Because a lot of us are relatively young, I guess. I said in a long career.
Yeah.
I think it's just like no time like the present to go pursue what you want, knowing that you'll always have this to come back to.
It's a really great point. I think, yeah, I don't know. It's so true that, I mean, I feel personally, I think all of these things apply so much more broadly than just finance, because think everyone has that fear when they're trying to transition into a new role. And it's an interesting way to put it, where it's like, you know what, you can come back. Like it's okay. Like that's fine. And it's not, the job's not going anywhere.
Yeah. Like you're not going to forget how to be a VP of marketing or VP of finance in a year or two. Now, if
Yeah,
it's like 5 or
exactly.
10 years, like, okay, maybe that's a different story. But like at that point, I'm sure you have 5 or 10 years of entirely different experience that's going to be useful somewhere else. So
Yeah, so true. All right. Well, we've been talking for a while. I got two broader questions that I'm gonna kind of leave us with. So the first is, we've talked a lot about your journey, and I'm wondering if there's one single like biggest difference maker that you've had in your career. It could be a project that you've worked on, a mindset that you've always held, a person you got to learn from, really anything. Like, what was the driver of a lot of your success so far?
So slightly different subject. I'd say that the driver of most of my success has been around taking care of myself.
Fair.
And so much of banking is like throwing yourself on a hand grenade and like every single day of like, sure, I'll work this weekend and
Yeah.
not take any time for myself and all that. Like I got a career / life coach in 2018 and I've been working with a coach for the last like 4 years. I
Nice.
do meditation, I do yoga, like I do a lot of other sort of like self-development stuff that keeps me and my emotional reality in line. It helps me really be a better, treat myself better, and more importantly, treat
Yeah.
people around me better. And it enables me to have a different perspective. I think that's the value of coaches, is that like Olympic athletes have coaches because like as a swimmer, I can't see if my right arm is like coming up to the right too much as I'm stroking, right? And a
Yep.
value of having a coach is different than having a friend or a mentor, is because they're paid to help you see your blind spots.
Yep.
And as you take on new roles and responsibilities and have just more stress and more life happen, it's really, really helpful to have someone identify those blind spots for you and help you work through them.
I think that's a great way to answer the question. Not a different topic. It could have been anything. I knew it was
Mhm.
going to be a tougher question, and honestly, these last two always are because they're so broad. But I think that's a really interesting answer, and yeah, just I think it's good advice for, again, anyone. This is getting to
Mhm.
be a whole career conversation, not just for finance, but applies to everybody. And the last question I'll ask you, it might be a similar answer, but it's a question we ask everyone who comes on. It's just, what is one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you started your career in finance?
I think the one thing I wish I thought about more along the way was there's a lot of value in knowing choosing which company you're going to. And I think there's some level, like, I think getting your foot in the door is one thing, and that's great. You should definitely take that job that gets you the foot in the door coming from banking or from, Big Four. Like, do that. I think, if you've read Zero to One by Peter Thiel or just understand venture returns, there's not it's a power law, right? There's disproportionate returns for the top 1%, top 10%. That is true in tech. And because so much of your compensation is tied up in equity, that's also very much true for your own like personal economic outcome. And so don't treat all startups as equal.
Mm.
Like figure out a rubric that matters for you. I think for every person that's going to be different. I've optimized primarily for myself, for my team, the people I work with, because I know I operate at 100% when I like the people I work with. Some people, that's not a problem for them. They can work at 100% no matter who they're working with. But for me, that's been really important for me to be like the best version of myself. And so know what the sort of rubric is for you across businesses. Some of that could be like that business's potential for success. That could be the network of the senior executives that I want to have access to in the future. That could be like the aptitude or the potential aptitude of the other employees who might be starting cool new startups after they leave this company, like whatever that might be. Like figure what that rubric is for yourself and be okay turning down opportunities even if they look better to other people,
Mm.
because their rubric's different.
That's a new one. I'll be honest. That's really cool. I like that idea, especially as somebody who hasn't spent that much time in startup world. For me, that is personally really great advice. So appreciate that, and I think it's a good way to kind of end our main sort of topic. So, just wanted to say thank you so much for joining, for sharing all of your experience and things like that. But I want to turn the floor over to you. Where can people go to learn or to connect with you, to learn more about what you're working on now?
Mm-hmm.
Anything you want to plug or pitch? The floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, for sure. Follow me on LinkedIn, or add me on LinkedIn rather. Message me. I'm happy to chat. I write in Forbes. I have a podcast myself called Awkward Conversations. If you're interested in joining any of these communities, hit me up. I'm happy to talk about the pros and cons of each of them. if you want to talk about coaching, tell you all about that experience I've had. And yeah, just in general career stuff, this is a topic I talk a lot of people about. As I said, I mentored probably a couple dozen people into tech from investment banking. I've probably mentored a dozen people from more junior roles in finance into their first sort of director VP roles. And so have a lot of ideas in this, and I'm happy to chat.
Awesome. Well, I think from what I've learned over the last 45 minutes or so, I think those mentees are lucky to have you. And just, thanks again for being a guest on the Roll Forward, and hope we can do it again sometime.
Great. Thanks a lot, Joe.
Thanks, Peter. Bye.
Thank you for checking out this episode of The Roll Forward. This show is powered by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow The Roll Forward wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or visit mosaic.tech/podcast to get immediate access to all of the latest episodes.